to our Mammoth Interactive's course on Unity first-person shooters. Alright, let's go. Now that we created the player, now we want to create the enemies, okay? We already have shooting bullets, we have movement, we have jumping, but we have no challenge and nothing to score right now. So let's use the same logic we use for the bullet to create the enemy, okay? So let's go to the hierarchy view, right click, 3D object, and then click cube, okay? We're going to rename the cube for enemy. Here you go, we have the enemy. Alright, and since we have the enemy, let's change its color so it's looks more menacing, okay? We're going to the project window, we're going to right click in here, select create, and this time we're going to select a material, okay? And material, basically, let's call it enemy material. And the material is the component responsible for setting the color, to set rendering options like metallic properties, smoothness. You can set if it's transparent or opaque, okay? So you can set lots of things. But for now, let's basically select the color to be red, okay? Now we are going to select our enemy in the hierarchy. We're going to expand the mesh renderer component, expand the materials component in here. You see that right now it is using the default material. Now we want to drag our enemy material there so it follows the color we used, okay? Let's drag it here, and now we have a red enemy. Okay, starting to look good. So let's see everything. Let's drag the enemy a bit down here. Okay, the enemy will be this little cube, and this little cube will move towards the player. Alright, so first of all, let's create this script for the enemy. Okay, let's go to the project in here. We're going to right click, select create, and then C# script. Let's name enemy controller. Alright, and before we forget everything, let's select enemy in here, get the enemy component, get the enemy controller, and drag it here in the inspector. So our enemy has the enemy controller script. Okay, now let's create the enemy prefab. Do you remember how we do this? Pause the video for a while. To do this, we have to drag this game object and go here to the project window. Drag it there, okay? So when you do this, just as you made a bullet, you have the enemy prefab in here as well. So now that we have the prefab saved already with its color, with its script, we can go to the enemy and delete it, okay? Because we can just re-add it later if you want, okay? Alright, let's go. Now, when we created the player script, we made the player responsible for spawning the bullet, because the player is the one who fires the bullets. But who spawns the enemies? Okay, we're going to think of a higher entity in here. We're going to kind of think in the game scene controller. Okay, so we're going to create a game object that controls the game for us. So we're going to tidy up this hierarchy a little bit. Okay, right click in here, select 3D object. Sorry about that. So right click and click create empty. Okay, we are not going to add anything right now, and rename it as game scene controller. And what you're going to do is you're going to drag everything that is in the hierarchy to the game scene controller, so the hierarchy looks like this. Okay, so it gives you a better understanding that we have something that is controlling the game, something that is overseeing the game logic. Okay, we could of course made the code in the player in here to spawn the enemies, but this is not very good organizing speaking. Okay, so let's right click in the project window, let's create a script, right, C# script, and let's name it game scene controller. And you guess right, you are going to drag this script to the game scene controller. Okay, drag it here. Alright, and then we have it. Okay, now we have two different game codes to deal with. We're going to use the enemy controller, so double click it so it is loaded in mono. Okay, you can close the other ones for now, and you can double click the game scene controller. Okay, now let's make a field to get access to the enemy controller. Public game object enemy prefab. Alright, Let's save, go back to Unity, wait for the code to compile, and when you select the game scene controller, you see that a new field has been added here, which is the enemy prefab. Okay, let's drag the prefab to that field so our game scene controller knows who the enemy is. And to make a very simple test, let's see if everything is working. We're going to use game object dot instantiate. The type is game object because we're going to spawn a prefab, and then we put enemy prefab in here. Okay, and all of this is going to be a enemy object. All right, and let's set the position of enemy object dot transform dot position to be a new vector 3, and let's put it on, say, 3 1 0. Okay, let's see what happens when we play the game. Let's hit play, wait for the code to compile in here, and okay, there it is. We have an enemy, which is a simple cube floating in our screen. Okay, now before making the collision with the enemy, we need to set a rule for our game on how the enemies will be spawned. Okay, and for this game, here's what we are going to do. Let's create a public float enemy timer. Okay, actually you don't need to make it public, let's make it private. Okay, private float enemy timer is going to be 0. Okay, and now we're going to set another one, private float enemy timer, let's say enemy spawn interval. We're going to set it to 2 seconds. Actually, 1 second is better. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to make some sort of clock that is going to tick down, and whenever it hits 0, we're going to spawn an enemy. Okay, let's do this. In the update function, you're going to make enemy timer minus equals time dot delta time. This is the most important thing for timers. Basically, you are decrementing how much time has passed since the last frame, and you're going to make it go down, 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 and when it hits 0, so we make if enemy timer minus or equals is lesser or equals than 0, you're going to put the logic for spawning the enemy in here, and most importantly as well, you're going to reset the enemy timer to whatever value you want it to be. Okay, so we're going to set enemy timer equals to enemy spawn interval. Okay, so when this happens, the enemy timer is going back to 1, okay, which is 1 second, and in every frame that is called, the enemy timer is going to decrease by how much time passed since the last frame. And when it hits 0, it's reset again and goes back down. So what this is doing is, since the spawn interval is 1 second, this will spawn 1 enemy per second. Okay, so this spawning logic that is here is going to be transferred to this place. Okay, but where are we going to spawn our enemies? The position is going to be relative to the player, okay, to make things interesting. The spawn enemies will be always close to the player, and they will always be chasing the player. So we also in here need a reference to our player. So we can just add another field, public. Actually, let's add it before the enemy prefab. Let's put it here, public game object and hero, which is the name we are giving in here. Okay, so, and also to test this timer, let's put a simple debug.log call in here. Name it spawn enemy. Okay, the reason we're doing this is to see if the prints are coming 1 at each second, and it's going to be print in the console. Okay, right, wait for the code to compile. Alright, you see that the game scene controller now has the reference to our hero. Let's drag it here just in case. Okay, right, everything's here. So when we hit play, okay, pay attention to the console in here. We have a message called spawn enemy, and it's being called 1 time per second. So C7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so we successfully made a timer, okay, that ticks on a certain interval. Alright, so there you go, debug log spawn enemy. Okay, now we want to actually spawn the enemies in here, so we are going to get this code from here to here, okay? And as I told you before, we want to make a special logic for spawning the enemies related to the position of our hero. So instead of hard setting the position like this, we're going to make a new vector3, open parenthesis, close it, and now we're going to set the positions in here. So let's start by using hero.transform.position.x, do the same for y, and the same for z, okay? As it is, this is the hardest game in the world because the enemies will spawn right in front of the player and it will die. So we need a slight interval from we need a slight distance from the player. Let's make another variable called private float enemy spawn distance, and let's put in here, say 15. Okay, so let's go back to the logic of spawning the enemy. Okay, let's just see what we're doing here. We are spawning the enemy, we're setting the enemy position to be in here, and now we want it to be a certain distance from the player. And we are going to use a little mathematical trick for this. Okay, we're going to define an angle, okay, spawn angle, that is going to be in a position from 0 to 360. Okay, what we essentially are going to do is, let me open the camera to illustrate this for you. We are going to select an angle, okay, a random angle, and spawn the enemy in any of these places. Okay, it's just like we did to spawn the bullet a little offset from the player. We're going to define an imaginary circle around the player like this, and the enemies will spawn somewhere in some position of this circle. Okay, so let's move forward. We're going to create an angle in here. So to use random numbers, you use this random dot range. You're going to find the minimum number, which is going to be 0, and the maximum number, which is going to be 360. Okay, and now that we have an angle, we are going to use the same mathematical logic we used for spawning the bullets. So in the x, we're going to use mathf.cosine, and in here you're going to pass the spawn angle, okay, and multiply it by the enemy spawn distance we defined, enemy spawn distance. Same for z, mathf.sine spawn angle multiplied by enemy spawn distance. Okay, when you have this, you have the enemies spawned in that circle. So let's go for Unity, wait for it to compile in here. Okay, and whenever we hit play, here we are in the scene, we have an enemy there and an enemy there, so enemies are spawning, okay, out of control. If you go to the scene, you see that the enemy cubes are appearing in here. Alright, so it's just like I told you, there's an imaginary circle in here, and the size is 15, which was the one we defined, and enemies are just spawning. Okay, right now they're useless, they're standing still, but we will make them move towards the player. Alright, and see that whenever I move far from these enemies, since we are using the position relative to the player, the enemies will keep spawning close to the player, so no matter how much you run, they will chase you down. Okay, alright, so hope you understood this. If you had any issues with this, just pause the video. Okay, take your time, there's no rush in here. And now we are going to make the enemies actually chase the player. And for this is going to be much simpler than before. We're going to put a public vector3 and then chase direction, okay, and also set a public float speed. Let's use 2 for the enemies. Okay, now a little bit of trigonometry in here. Okay, the player is in here in this situation right now. Let's say the enemy is spawned in this place. Okay, how do I make sure the enemy is going in this direction? Okay, exactly in this direction to chase the player. Whenever you have 2 points and you get one and you subtract the other, you're going to have a vector pointing to that direction. So whenever I spawn the enemy, if I get the enemy position and subtract the player position, you are going to have this vector. You're going to have an arrow that points to whatever the player is positioned. Okay, so how do we do this? Now we have a public vector called chase direction. Okay, and in here we're going to do enemy. First we need to get the enemy controller. Okay, so enemy controller enemy. All right, we need a reference to the actual enemy script. Is going to be enemy object dot transform dot get component. We're going to pass in here enemy controller. Okay, and enemy controller enemy dot chase direction is going to be enemy dot transform dot position minus hero dot transform dot position. And even more than that, okay, let's go back to Unity. When I said you had this vector in here, okay, this vector already contains magnitude, so this is actually a number that could be bigger. It's actually a vector which components are going to be bigger than 1. So this, for example, might be 5 on x and minus 2 on y, but we want this to be normalized. We want this to be from 0 to 1, because this is going to be used to multiply the direction to the speed. So when we have this, we're going to also use dot normalized. Okay, here you have vector, and when you access the normalized property, you access values which range from 0 to 1. So instead of getting an arrow that big, you're going to get an arrow like this, for example. And if you multiply it by whatever velocity you have, you can have a vector like this, or you could have a larger one. Okay, you have the freedom to set the speed of the enemy and make sure it works properly. Okay, now the enemy has a chase direction, and let's go to the enemy controller, and now we're going to simply move into that direction. You're going to use this dot transform dot position equals to new vector 3. We're going to move in the 3 directions, so this dot transform dot position dot x, same for y, and same for z. Okay, we have this, and now we're going to use the chase direction. So we're going to increment this x by the chase direction dot x and multiply it by the speed. Okay, notice that we are not using angles in here because we already have the direction we want to move. So we basically sum these two components, okay, the x of the chase direction, the x of the transform position, and multiply it by the speed. All right, and you're going to do the same for z. Okay, so it moves in this. All right, so save your code. Take your time to write this down, or to go back and see everything. All right, go to Unity, wait for the code to compile, and when we hit play, here's what you have. Okay, you actually have the cubes going away from you, and they are going pretty quick. So let's change this. All right, if you go to the game scene controller, instead of getting the enemy position and subtracting from the hero, we actually need to do the other way around. We actually use the hero first and subtract it from the enemy position, because what we are getting here was a vector that pointed from the hero to the enemy, so we do the opposite. Okay, and the speed, we want it to be slightly, actually a lot slower, so we select the enemy prefab. Instead of using 2, let's use 0.2. okay, save your code, hit play. Now you have enemies chasing you. Okay, they are spawning somewhere in the circle around you, and they are trying to get you. All right, so we are getting pretty close of having our first-person shooter game. All right, in the next lesson we are going to make the bullets actually destroy the players, okay, the enemies. All right, so I see you in the next class. So this time let's make the enemies actually be destroyed by the bullets, because if we play the game right now and shoot them, the bullets just go through. So here's what we are going to do. First, select the bullet prefab, Okay, and now we're going to add a rigid body component to the bullet. Okay, and we are going to mark the is kinematic field. Okay, which means we are going to define the physics rules for the sphere, but you don't need to worry about this right now. This is basically to tell that this can be collided with something, all right? Not just have the sphere collider, but you also need to add the rigid body. Okay, all right. Now we're going to deal with the enemy. Okay, you select the enemy prefab, you go to the box collider component and make sure the is trigger field is marked. Okay, it should be like this and you need to set it to this. Okay, and how do we make the collisions? We're going to the enemy controller script and we're going to type in the following function: public void on collider enter. Sorry, on trigger enter. Okay, and the attribute in here will be a collider, which we're going to name call. Okay, we're going to open the method in here, and to make sure that the collisions are working, we are going to print whatever is colliding with the enemy. So debug.log, we're going to use call.gameObject.name. Okay, what this does is basically we're going to print the name of whatever game object is hitting us. Okay, let's test it out. Go to Unity, wait for the code to compile. When it's done, you hit play and pay attention to the console window in here. Right, an enemy. Notice that when it hits the player, the FPS controller name is printed, and whenever I shoot a bullet, you see that bullet clone is being put in the console window. Okay, the clone number appears in here because we are cloning a prefab. This is an instance of a prefab, but still we now have access whenever the enemy hits the player, and it should be game over, and whenever the bullet hits the enemy, and the enemy should be destroyed. Here's what we're going to do to make the logic for the bullet hitting the enemy. We're going to use if call.gameObject.getController, get component. It means if this is different than null, if a bullet controller component exists in the game object of this collider, then it means it is a bullet. So we are going to destroy the enemy. We're going to use gameObject.destroy this .gameObject. Okay, you basically tell Unity to destroy yourself, the game object which contains the enemy controller. Okay, and we also want to destroy the bullet, so gameObject.destroy call.gameObject. Okay, so we go to Unity, wait for the code to compile, and we hit play. Okay, let's see, we have an enemy, and whenever we hit it with a bullet, the enemy disappears. Alright, okay, so this should be enough for this video. In the next one, actually before moving forward, I am thinking this is a bit hard. Alright, I am a noob. Okay, let's go to the enemy prefab, let's change its velocity to speed to be 0.05. okay, and bullets are okay. Alright, so of course you feel free to tune the game as you want. You can make the enemies chase you a bit slower, you can make the game spawn enemies a bit faster. This is up to you. You are the game developer and the game designer here. Alright, so in the next lesson we're going to make the collision of the enemy with the player and send a game over message. Alright, I hope to see you there.